Good morning, grade 4s. Today's lesson will be taught by Pirate because I'm tired of teaching you maths. Hey Pirate, you can start now. Morning, grade 4s. Pirate changed his mind. He's feeling a bit camera shy. He doesn't want to teach you maths this morning, which means it's me again teaching you maths. We are looking at patterns today. Let's jump across to our presentation. So, a reminder, if you have any questions, just email me, grade4@worksheetcloud.com. That can be about the maths that we're doing, about some other maths that you're doing, about how your times table challenge is going. I don't mind. I'll try and get back to you. After the lesson, if you click on the link above, you can do the worksheet, and that should give you a good idea whether you've understood what we do in this lesson, patterns, and if not, maybe watch the lesson again or let me know and we can spend a little bit more time on this. So, patterns. That's what this is about. So our goals for the lesson, pretty straightforward. We're going to recognize simple patterns and be able to extend them. So be able to find the missing numbers, be able to find where it comes from, where it goes to, that sort of thing. Patterns occur in nature and in real life all the time. So that nautilus shell up top over there, it's been cut open, but that sort of thing, you can see inside the flowers, there are patterns, inside plants, the way leaves are shaped. So patterns occur in nature all the time. And in fact, my brain, I'm sure you know that I like maths, but my brain tries to make patterns out of numbers all the time. In fact, if I'm doing exercise, I can't stop myself. I count how many times I'm doing something. I can't stop it. It happens. If I'm walking past or driving and I see a number plate, my brain tries to make a pattern out of it. So, yeah, it's just my brain is all over the show. So the other day I saw the number plate 102030, 102030, which doesn't sound particularly amazing. But if you break it up into pairs, then it's 10, 20, 30. So my brain automatically found that pattern. I also saw a number plate 247344. And my brain managed to turn that into, well, 24 hours in a day, 7 days a week, and then unfortunately the pattern didn't work because it was 344 instead of 365. So 24/7, 365. My brain was trying to make a pattern from it. Okay, when we look at patterns, there are lots of different types of patterns. Some of those patterns repeat, so the number or set of numbers go over and over again. Some get bigger, some get smaller, and some are pictures. So with repeating patterns, those are perhaps the easiest ones to recognize. The first thing, and that's the first thing you should check for, is the pattern something that's repeating over and over, whether it's numbers or whether it's pictures. Something interesting to note when it is pictures is perhaps take a look to see whether you can find numbers that relate to the pictures. I'll give you some more detail on that in a little bit. And then if the patterns are getting bigger or smaller, well, at this stage, so when I say at this stage, I mean grade 4, most patterns will be quite simple. So if they're getting bigger, then they have to do with times or plus, because those are the operations that make things bigger. And if they're getting smaller, they will have to do with divide or minus, because those are the operations that make things smaller. So at this stage, that's pretty much what you're looking for. If it's getting bigger, you look for whether there's a plus or a times. If it's getting smaller, you look for a minus or a divide. Oh, apologies. This is where I switch over to the worksheets, the whiteboard, and have a look at some patterns. So I thought we would start with some picture patterns. First off, you can see the pattern at the top is just squares, and the only thing that's changing is the color. I'm not sure I really need to go any further with that pattern. I'm sure anyone can see that. What do you think the next block will be? I'm going to do it. It will be a green square, followed by, apparently this is red, but it seems more pink than red to me. but there we go. It's a pink square, a red square, green square, red square, green square, red square. That's the information we have. That's what it looks like. That's the most likely pattern that would continue from there. Of course, if you were doing this in your book, I hope you would use a ruler just to make sure that those patterns are nice. I mean, those squares are nice and straight and exact. If I look at the next one, it's not about color, it's about shape. So I am looking there and I see it goes square, circle, triangle, square, circle, triangle. So if I'm checking for a repeating pattern, I notice that this is repeated over there, and then I can assume that the next one will be a continuation of this repetition. So square, circle, triangle, square, circle, triangle, and so on and so forth. We could also have a look at a pattern like this, which seems to have some repetition. We've got triangle, hexagon, hexagon, triangle, hexagon, hexagon, triangle. What do you think is going to come next? Well, my looking suggests that it will be a hexagon. Oh my goodness, that's a terribly drawn hexagon. It'll be another one of these. All right, so there'll be another 2 of these and then a triangle, another 2 of these, because your pattern is that, and that's the part that repeats over and over again. So that repeats there, and then it will repeat there, and so on and so forth. Before we look at that bottom one, I thought I'd start with something on the right that looks a little like this. So what if our first one was this, our second one was this, the third one had 5 sides. What do you think the next one will have? 6 sides, and so on. So when I said earlier on in that slide about looking to take numbers out of pictures, I can see 3 sides, 4 sides, 5 sides, 6 sides, and I can assume that the next ones would be 7 sides and 8 sides. That's what I mean by taking numbers out of pictures. Let's look at the one down at the bottom. So we have 1 dot, then we have 3 dots, then we have 6 dots, then 10 dots, then 15 dots. But if you notice that each time we're just adding 1 extra line of dots at the bottom of our pyramid. So there we can have a look, and then the number is the total of dots. We'll come and have a look at one of these patterns or sequences later on, but that's a slightly more complex pattern. I'm just showing you that we can see patterns in lots of different ways. You can do the same with squares. So the first one could be that, and the next one I'm going to add like that to make a slightly bigger square, and in the next one, let me first draw my previous one, and then I'll add the extra dots. And you can see how that pattern will progress as it gets bigger and bigger. But if I was just looking at the numbers, I would see 1, 4, 9, and so on, which is a pattern. More complex pattern, we might get to something like that. We might stick to some simple ones. So remember when we did the input and output machines and we had a look at what goes in and what comes out? Well, patterns use the same kind of ideas. So we've got to see that the same rule will work for everything in the pattern. So let's start off with probably the most simple pattern that there can possibly be. What do you think the next 2 ones are there? I hope everyone got that before I had my sip of coffee. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is quite simply counting. Perhaps we could have done this and started, and I'm using the same pattern, 57, 58, 59. Don't be confused by the fact that it starts not at the beginning of the counting. it's still got a gap of 1, gap of 1, gap of 1, and a gap of 1. And in fact, still part of the same group of patterns, I could go 10, 9, 8. So again, I'm counting in ones, but this time going backwards. So 7, 6. So these are some quite simple patterns to have a look at. Another way that you might be asked this kind of pattern at school is where you get something like this. 5, 6, and you need to find out what are the things in between. Well, the way that we're going to do this is we're going to see if we can find our input-output machine and then see if it works. So in other words, we find a rule and we test whether it will work. So if I see 5 and 6, I can see there's a gap of 1. So what I'm going to try is to find a gap of 1, and see if I will get to 9. And if I do, then I can be fairly sure that that's the right pattern. So 5 plus 1 was 6, 6 plus 1 was 7, 7 plus 1 was 8, 8 plus 1 was 9. So I can see that it's true that that pattern works. In this one, each time I was minusing 1 or subtracting 1. In these ones, it was plus 1. So these were all variations of the patterns that use plus 1. Let's have a look at a slightly more complicated one. Slightly more complicated. I'm going to do 2 patterns underneath each other. I'm going to start with this pattern. And underneath that, I'm going to do this pattern. See if you can find a rule and test to see whether it's correct. So I'm looking at the top one, and that looks a little bit more difficult, but let's start off by having a look at the gap. What I mean by the gap is what's between 5 and 7. Well, there is a gap of 2, so I added 2. Let's check if that's going to work and get me from 5 to 7. Plus 2, yeah, that works. So because I can now see my pattern works, I can use that to continue my pattern. Many of you at this stage will be able to do these sorts of patterns in your head. I'm just getting you into the good habits of checking what the difference is, what the gap is, so that you'll be able to figure out the more complex ones later on. The one underneath would probably have been easier for you to do, although it's the same pattern. It's part of a times table that we use often. So it's the 2 times table, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on. So that's a pattern that we recognize easily. I just wanted to show you that just because it's a times table over here and it's not a times table over there, it's still using the same pattern. And the rule or the pattern is we add 2 each time. So plus 2 each time. Plus 2 each time. Let's have a look at a third one. Those of you who've been practicing your times table might recognize those numbers come from a times table. They come from the 9 times table. But even if you didn't, let's just look at the gaps. So the gap between 27 and 36 is 9. As a small note, how did I check that was 9? I can go 36 minus 27 and work that out. But what I noticed and what I did in my head was to get from 27 to 37 would have been 10, because all I'm changing is my tens. And then I'm like, well, it's 1 less than that, so 1 less than 10 is 9. That's what the process is in my head. You can count on your fingers if you want to, although by grade 4 you should start to not need your fingers anymore. But if you did, just remember that you don't count the first number, you count from the number after that. So 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. So 9 extras gave you 36. And the reason you count from after that is we already have that, and we only use one of the 9 to get to the next number. Okay, that was a little bit of a sidetrack, but let's check from 36 to 45. Yes, it's plus 9. So we've got plus 9 as our rule. We get 54, 63. This pattern would have probably been a little harder to see or to figure out if the numbers that you got were these. No, you wouldn't have got that one. That one would you have to find. And the reason it would be a bit harder is because these ones, although the gaps are the same, those numbers are not in one of the times tables, so your brain might not recognize them straight away. But again, you just check the gaps. It does work, so then you continue with the pattern. We could have had the pattern being 95. This one I'd like you to try on your own. 97, 99. You see if you can figure out the next two. Just going to move this up a bit. Okay, because we are looking at good habits and getting our habits correct, let's look at the gap between the two. So 95 to 97 is plus 2, plus 2. So that's easy enough. We just got to add plus 2. These kind of ones come up quite often, and the reason is because you've got to cross over from 2 digits to 3 digits. But 99, 100, 101, plus 2, 103. Right, so again, it's just using the same practice, but it's crossing over the hundreds barrier. Next one. See if you can figure out the next two in this sequence. And then we will go on to some slightly more complicated ones. I'll put one up and for those people who finished number 5, and you can see if this one is one that you can make sense of. Back to number 5. If I have a look at 48, to get from 48 to 44, I'm minusing 4. Minusing 4. Pattern works. Let's keep going. So 36, 32. Here we go. So there's a pattern getting smaller. So we've used plus and minus so far. See if I can pickle your brains with number 6. This one's a little harder. But even still, you start off by having a look at the gaps. So let's have a look. The gap between 2 and 4 is 2. The gap between 4 and 8 is 4. The gap between 8 and 16 is 8. Well, our gaps are not all the same, but what do you notice about the numbers that are coming out of our gaps? The gap between those is 2. No, let me not go into that. All right. So if these are getting bigger each time, so that's times 2, times 2, times 2. Let's see if times 2 will work. So 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. Yep, the rule is working. So let's continue with that. 16 times 2. Ooh. This is a great opportunity for me to remind you of what we practiced when we practiced the distributive law just the other day. So if I'm doing 2 times 16, I can break that down into 10 and 6. Then I can I've pushed you off the bottom of the screen. Then I can say, well, that is the same as saying 2 times 10 plus 2 times 6, 20 plus 12, 32. So I would have done that in my head, but there we go. We can get to 32. And times 2 again. I'm not going to do the distributive law, but you could do it yourself. 64. If you have learned different types of multiplication, you can use those as well. So you could, for example, let's do 32 times 2. You could use this. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6, and you would have got 64. If that's the way you practice multiplication at school or at home. So it doesn't matter which way you get there, as long as you get to the correct answer. So the pattern works over there. Let's have a look at another pattern. Also the slightly more complicated ones. What do you think the next numbers are in there? So start off by having a look at the gaps. So if I look at the gaps, I see a gap of 1, I see a gap of 2, I see a gap of 3. What do you think the next gap's going to be? If you guessed 4, you were correct. And then we would have a gap of 5. And so on and so forth. Okay, there we go. So the trick is to always look at the gap and then to think of a rule. And if you think your rule is correct, then you can move on and check it. And if it holds true, then you can use it for the missing numbers. Try this one. Again, start by looking at the gaps. So in fact, this is the exact same pattern as the one in the previous one. It just started on a different number. So plus 5 would make that 23, 29. There we go. Number 9, another one to check out. These kind do not come up all that often in grade 4. You won't often find these ones. The most common ones you'll find are plus and minus, and then times, and then this one, which is divide. So because you have to start with quite big numbers, otherwise you get down into fractions or small, really small pieces of numbers, which is fractions. For these ones, you don't normally get them, but let's have a quick look. So this 24 is half of 48, so I divided by 2. 12 is half of 24, so I divided by 2. So let me divide by 2 again. Half of 12 is 6. Half of 6 is 3. And you'll see that it's hard to divide 3 again, which is why I wouldn't continue this pattern, but we did do fractions, although we didn't do improper fractions. But let's think about it practically. If we've got 3 chocolates and we've got two people, well, each person will get a whole chocolate and then half of the next one. So you get 1 and a half. And you can see how this is a little bit more difficult. And so that's why division doesn't normally come up in patterns in grade 4, but just so that you're aware that you can have division as a pattern. Okay, I have 3 more. One is, no, let me do these 2 for you to try on your own, and then I'll end with a more complicated one where you've got 2 steps, which does sometimes come up in grade 4. Okay, so let's see. So this time, instead of just asking you what the next numbers are in the sequence, I'm going to give it to you like this. So there are 3 numbers I want at the start. These numbers are ones we know. And then I want 1 more after that. So have a look at those and see if you can figure out what the last number is and what the first 3 numbers are. And when you're done with that, then try number 11. Right, well, it doesn't matter where, I'm looking at number 10 now. If you need more time for 10, just pause the video. It doesn't matter where the numbers are that we know, we can still look at the gaps between 2 numbers that are next to each other. So the gap between these 2 numbers and the gap between these 2 numbers. So let's have a look. Well, you can count them. So 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46. It's a gap of 8. Let's just check what the other gap is. 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54. It's also 8. So because those 2 gaps are 8, we can assume that all of the gaps are 8. So let's move forward from 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62. And then we move backwards. So now we're going to minus 8 to get to the one before 30, and minus 8 to get to the one before that, and minus 8 to get to the one before that. And there we go. If you need a little bit more time for number 11, pause the video. I'm going to go through it straight away so that the video for today's lesson doesn't run too long. Let's start off by looking at the only gap we possibly have where we've got 2 numbers next to each other. So what's the difference between those 2? Well, I see a gap of 3. So we don't know for sure that this gap is getting bigger or smaller or anything like that. But let's try and figure out this number in between and see if we will get to the next one. So let's go minus 3 to get to there and minus 3 again. We're doing minus 3 because we're going backwards. We did plus 3 because we were going forwards. Let's use the minus 3 and let's check if it'll work. So 22 minus 3 gives me 19. 19 minus 3 gives me 16. So I now know that my gaps are all going to be 3. And I've checked to see that it is correct. So now from here, I can work backwards to find the first 3 numbers. So 16 minus 3 gives me 13. Minus 3 gives me 10. Minus 3 gives me 7. So I've worked backwards through that set in order to get it. Okay, one last one, and these will be sort of the last couple of questions in the worksheet, the more complicated ones. And the question or the pattern I'm going to give to you is, let's use 10, 15, 13, 18, 16. Oops. The reason we put commas in between is so that when numbers are close together, we can still see that they're separate numbers. Otherwise, you might think that this was one long number. So we put the commas between, and sometimes people put semicolons. We put those in between in order to show you that they are separate numbers, although it's quite easy to see in my spaced out writing that they were separate. So again, doesn't matter what pattern we're looking at, we start off by looking for the gaps. So the gap here is 5. We went up by 5. Then what happened? Oh, we got smaller. So something different happened. Over here, it went down by 2. Let's check the next one. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Okay, so we went back to going plus 5. What do you think the next one's going to be? Let's check. 18, 17, 16, minus 2. So it seems that we have 2 steps to this pattern. First we do plus 5, then next one we do minus 2, then plus 5, minus 2. So the next one would be plus 5, and the one after that would be minus 2. And we can use that to fill in what we need to. So plus 5 would make 21, minus 2 would make 19. Okay, so again, just a reminder, it comes down to checking the gaps. That's really, for patterns, the easiest thing you can do is just to go and check the gaps. So from Pirate and I, we're pretty much at the end of the lesson now. A reminder, any questions, great4@WorksheetCloud.com. Click on the link above to do the worksheet to check that you've understood patterns. Remember, patterns are in life all around you. Look for them. It makes life fun. Well, at least for a math teacher, it makes life fun. I love patterns and I look for them wherever I can. Have a fabulous rest of the day. Goodbye, grade 4s.